November 15th, 1315. A column of steel, 9,000 strong, snakes its way through a frozen alpine pass. This is the pride of the Habsburg dynasty, the most powerful and technologically advanced army in Europe. Heavy cavalry, knights clad head to toe in proofed steel, wielding lances and swords that cost more than a farmer's entire life. They are an unstoppable force, the medieval equivalent of a tank division, and they are here on a simple mission: to crush a rebellion of insolent peasants, to burn their villages, salt their fields, and make an example of them so terrifying that no commoner would ever dare defy a nobleman again. The knights are confident. The duke leading them is arrogant. The day should be over by noon. But as they march deeper into the narrows, with a frozen lake on one side and a steep wooded slope on the other, they are unaware of two things. First, they are not the hunters here, they are the prey. And second, almost none of them will ever leave this valley alive. This isn't just a battle, it's an extermination. And if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten turning points in history that prove giants can fall, make sure you're subscribed. The story you're about to hear changed warfare forever. To understand the sheer shock of what happened in Morgarten, you have to understand the world of the early 14th century. It was a world built on a brutal, rigid hierarchy. At the bottom, you had the peasantry. They were the 99%, tied to the land, their lives dictated by the seasons and the whims of their lord. Above them, the church, and at the very top, the nobility, the warrior class, and the ultimate expression of their power was the mounted knight. A knight wasn't just a soldier, he was a weapon system. Years of dedicated training, a lifetime of horsemanship, and a suit of armor that was the pinnacle of military technology. On an open battlefield, a charge of heavy knights was a force of nature. It was considered military fact, as certain as gravity, that a small number of knights could defeat a much, much larger number of infantry. The peasants had farming tools, the knights had war horses, steel plate, and the divine right to rule. This order had held Europe in its grip for centuries. It seemed unbreakable. But in a remote corner of the Alps, a group of stubborn mountain folk were about to take a sledgehammer to that entire world view. They called themselves the Eidgenossen, the Oath Comrades. History knows them as the Old Swiss Confederacy. These were the people from the forest cantons of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden. They weren't like the peasants of the flatlands. Living in these isolated, rugged mountain valleys bred a different kind of person. Fiercely independent, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of any outside authority. They had an ancient charter, a Reichsfreiheit, that theoretically made them answerable only to the Holy Roman Emperor himself, not to any local duke or king. For years, this protected their autonomy. But a new power was rising in the region, the House of Habsburg, ambitious, ruthless, and determined to consolidate their power base. And their expanding territory was starting to press right up against these free cantons. The Habsburgs saw a collection of disobedient peasants. The Swiss saw an existential threat to their way of life. The stage was set for a conflict, not over a crown or a kingdom, but over the fundamental right to be left alone. The final spark wasn't a grand declaration of war. It was a messy, local squabble. The flashpoint was Einsiedeln Abbey, a wealthy monastery under the protection of the Habsburgs. For generations, the people of Schwyz and the abbey had argued over grazing rights and forest lands on their shared border. The Schwitzers claimed the land was theirs by ancient tradition. The abbey claimed it was theirs by legal charter. In 1314, after years of simmering tension, a band of men from Schwyz took matters into their own hands. They launched a raid on the abbey, plundering its resources and even abducting some of the monks. To the Schwyz, this was them asserting their rights. To the Habsburgs, this was an act of open rebellion, an insult that could not be ignored. It was the perfect excuse they needed to march their armies in and crush the forest cantons once and for all, bringing them firmly under Habsburg control. The man tasked with teaching the peasants a lesson was Duke Leopold I of Habsburg. Leopold was the younger brother of the claimant to the imperial throne, Frederick the Fair. He was young, ambitious, and had a reputation as a skilled and aggressive military commander. But he was also famously hot-headed and possessed the deep-seated arrogance common to the high nobility of his time. The idea that a collection of cowherders and woodsmen would dare to defy his family's authority was not just a political problem, it was a personal insult. In his mind, this wouldn't be a war, it would be a punitive expedition, a pest control operation. There was no question of defeat. The only question was how brutally he would make his point. He called his banners, summoning knights and mercenaries from across his domains. He was not assembling an army to fight another army. He was gathering a force of overwhelming power to inflict a massacre. And what a force it was! Leopold gathered an army of somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 men. The core of this army was its heavy cavalry, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 of them. These were the elite, the nobility of Swabia, Alsace, and Austria, each a walking fortress. They were supported by thousands of professional infantry, men-at-arms, and mercenaries who knew their business. This was a state-of-the-art combined arms military machine. They were well-fed, well-paid, and supremely well-equipped. They were absolutely certain of their technological and social superiority. As they gathered, the talk in the camp was not about strategy, but about the spoils, how they would divide the peasants' lands, what ransoms they might get for any local leaders. Some chronicles even report that the knights brought along coils of rope, specifically to hang the Swiss rebels after their swift and inevitable victory. Their overconfidence was absolute. Meanwhile, in the forest cantons, the mood was one of grim determination. News of Leopold's massive army sent a wave of fear through the valleys. The Swiss could muster at most around 2,000 men, and these were not soldiers. They were farmers, hunters, loggers. They had no armor to speak of, maybe a leather jerkin or a steel cap if they were lucky. They had no war horses. Their weapons were the tools of their trade, adapted for war. A meeting of the canton leaders was held. They knew that facing Leopold's army in an open field would be mass suicide. Their small numbers and lack of cavalry would be their doom. They had only one advantage, one ally that the Habsburgs didn't: the mountains themselves. They had to choose a battlefield where the knights' greatest strengths, their horses and their heavy armor, would become their greatest weaknesses. They had to turn the landscape into a weapon. Their choice was a small pass near the village of Morgarten. It was one of the main routes into the canton of Schwyz, and it was a death trap. The path ran along the shore of the cold, deep Lake Agery. On the other side, the ground rose sharply into a steep, wooded slope. The path itself was narrow, uneven, and in the freezing cold of mid-November, likely slick with ice. A large army couldn't use its numbers here. It would be forced to stretch out into a long, thin column, maybe only a few men wide. The knights at the front would be unable to see what was happening at the back. The men at the back would be trapped by the men in front. They would have no room to charge, no room to maneuver, no room to even form a proper battle line. And, most importantly, no room to escape. The Swiss knew every inch of this terrain. They knew where the path was narrowest and where the slopes above were steepest. They weren't just choosing a place to fight, they were engineering an ambush on a massive scale. And they had the perfect tool for the job. It wasn't a sword. Swords were sidearms, often ineffective against plate armor. The Swiss weapon of choice was something far more brutal and versatile, the halberd. Think of it as the Swiss Army knife of pole arms. It was a 6-foot wooden shaft with a complex head. At the top was a spear point, perfect for thrusting into the gaps of a knight's armor, the armpits, the visor, the joints. On one side was a massive heavy axe blade, capable of shearing through lesser armor or shattering bone even through plate. And on the other side, a wicked hook or spike. This was the game changer. With that hook, a peasant standing on the ground could reach up, snag a knight's armor or shield, and physically pull the nobleman down from his high horse, where he was clumsy and vulnerable. Once on the ground, his heavy armor became a prison. The halberd could then be used to finish him off. It was a cheap, effective weapon that in the hands of a strong man could nullify the knight's advantages. Leopold, confident in his strength, made a critical error. He split his forces, sending a smaller detachment to create a diversion while he led the main army through the Morgarten Pass. But the Swiss were waiting. How did they know Leopold's exact route? A popular legend, recorded by the chronicler Johannes von Winterthur, tells a dramatic story. The night before the battle, an arrow was supposedly fired into the Swiss camp by a friendly nobleman in the Habsburg army, a Count von Homburg, whose sympathies lay with the cantons. Tied to the arrow was a piece of parchment with a simple warning: "Beware at Morgarten." Whether this story is true or the result of good local scouting, the outcome was the same. The Swiss knew Leopold was coming. They knew where he was coming. They moved their main force to the slopes above the pass and waited in the freezing darkness. Imagine the contrast between the two camps on that final night. In the Habsburg camp below, there was feasting and celebration. This was the eve of a guaranteed victory. Wine flowed freely, and the knights boasted of the glory they would win on the morrow. They posted few guards, believing no one would be foolish enough to attack them. They were a force of nature, and nature does not need to be on its guard. High above them on the icy slopes, there was no celebration, only a cold, grim silence. The Swiss peasants and woodsmen huddled together for warmth, clutching their crude weapons. They had confessed their sins and prayed, preparing themselves for death. They were outnumbered, out-equipped, and facing the most feared army of their time. All they had was the terrain, their courage, and a desperate plan. They waited for the dawn. As dawn broke on November 15th, Leopold gave the order to advance. The vanguard of his army, composed of the most heavily armored and noble knights, entered the narrow path. The columns stretched back for over a mile. They were packed in, breastplate to rump, a glittering river of steel flowing into the jaws of the trap. The footing was treacherous, the cold was biting, but their spirits were high. They were the elite. What did they have to fear? As they moved deeper, the pass grew narrower still. The lake pressed in on their left, the steep, silent, tree-covered mountain on their right. They couldn't see the top of the slope. They couldn't see what was waiting for them in the woods. They were completely, utterly blind to the fate that was hanging, quite literally, over their heads. The Swiss on the slope held their breath. They watched as thousands of their enemies filed into the killing zone below. They had to wait for the perfect moment, not too early or the army could retreat, not too late or the vanguard might escape. They waited until the column was fully committed, packed into the narrowest part of the pass. Then from the heights came the signal, a single piercing blast from an alpine horn that echoed through the cold morning air. The first attack was not with spears or arrows, it was with gravity. The Swiss had spent the night preparing a horrifying barrage. They had cut down trees, piled up boulders, and gathered loose rocks. On the signal, they unleashed hell. A man-made avalanche of timber and stone crashed down the steep slope. It hit the packed column of knights with incredible force. Men and horses were crushed instantly under the impact. The sheer noise was terrifying, a thunderous roar of splintering wood, cracking stone, and the sudden sharp screams of men and animals. This wasn't a charge, it was a natural disaster. It was designed not just to kill, but to create pure, unadulterated chaos. And it worked perfectly. The effect on the Habsburg cavalry was immediate and catastrophic. The war horses, trained for the noise of battle, were not prepared for this. They panicked. Trapped in the narrow pass with no room to move, they became a liability. They reared, kicked, and trampled the dismounted infantrymen who were marching alongside them. Knights, the masters of the battlefield, were thrown from their saddles, landing heavily on the icy ground, their armor making it nearly impossible to get back up. The disciplined, terrifying column of the Habsburg army ceased to exist. In its place was a churning, screaming traffic jam of death and confusion. The vanguard was being crushed from above, while the rear of the column, blind to what was happening, continued to press forward, compacting the chaos even further. And then, through the dust and confusion, the second wave of the attack began. The Swiss infantry came pouring down the slope. This was their home turf. Many were said to be wearing spiked shoes or were even barefoot to get a better grip on the treacherous icy ground. They moved with a speed and confidence that was impossible for the heavily armored knights. They weren't soldiers in neat formations. They were a wave of ferocious mountain men appearing from the trees like vengeful spirits. They swarmed down into the disorganized rabble below, their long halberds held at the ready. The trap was sprung. Now the slaughter would begin. What followed was not a battle. It was a butchering. The knights, trapped and often dismounted, were at a complete disadvantage. Their primary weapon, the lance, was useless. Their swords were too short to be effective against the 6-foot reach of the halberds. The Swiss, on the other hand, were in their element. They systematically dismantled the Habsburg army. A hook would snag a knight's helmet, yanking him off balance. The axe blade would follow, a devastating blow to the head or neck. For those on the ground, the Swiss used the spear points to probe for weaknesses in their armor, delivering fatal thrusts. The knights were the richest, most powerful men in the land. But here, in this narrow pass, their wealth and status meant nothing. They were simply meat for the grinder, being cut down by men they considered little better than animals. The chaos was total. The front of the column was a killing zone. The rear of the column, finally realizing the disaster unfolding, tried to turn and flee, but the path was too narrow. Their retreat was blocked by their own men still marching forward. The resulting pressure was immense. Men and horses were literally squeezed off the path and into the icy waters of Lake Egeri. For a knight in full armor, this was a death sentence. The weight of their own protection dragged them down into the depths. They didn't die by the sword, but by drowning in the freezing water, helpless. The lake, which had been one wall of the trap, now became a mass grave. And what of Duke Leopold? The arrogant commander who had instigated this disaster? He was caught in the middle of it. He witnessed the complete and utter destruction of his proud army. Surrounded by his most loyal bodyguards, he was forced to fight for his own life. He didn't stand and fight to the last. He fled. Leopold and his entourage managed to cut their way out of the back of the trap and escape, leaving the vast majority of his men to their fate. The proud duke who had marched into the valley that morning to hang rebels fled with a handful of survivors, a broken and humiliated man. His army, the pride of the Habsburgs, had ceased to exist in the space of about 90 minutes. When the fighting stopped, the scale of the Habsburg defeat was staggering. Chronicles claim that over 1,500 soldiers, a huge number of them knights and nobles, lay dead in the pass and in the lake. The Swiss losses were minimal, perhaps a few dozen men. The valley floor was a treasure trove of armor, weapons, and the banners of some of the most noble families in the Holy Roman Empire. For the Swiss, it was a victory beyond their wildest dreams. For the rest of Europe, it was unthinkable. An army of peasants had not just defeated, but had utterly annihilated a modern professional army of knights. The news sent a shockwave across the continent. The myth of the invincible knight had been shattered. The victory at Morgarten had immediate and profound political consequences. Just a few weeks after the battle, the leaders of the three forest cantons met in the town of Brunnen. Buoyed by their incredible success, they renewed their alliance, creating the Pact of Brunnen. This was more than just a military agreement, it was a political statement. It declared that the cantons would not recognize any outside lord, that they would stand together against all external threats, and that they would settle their own internal disputes. Many historians see this as the true foundational moment of the old Swiss Confederacy, the seed from which the nation of Switzerland would eventually grow. Morgarten didn't just save their independence, it forged their identity. Morgarten was a brutal lesson for the military theorists of Europe. It didn't end the age of the knight overnight, but it was a key moment in a larger trend, the rise of infantry. Along with battles like Courtrai and later Crécy and Agincourt, Morgarten proved that well-led, well-motivated foot soldiers using the right tactics and terrain could defeat the most elite heavy cavalry. It showed that discipline and the right weapon could be more important than noble birth and expensive armor. Armies began to change. The focus slowly shifted from the individual prowess of the knight to the collective power of the infantry square. The battlefield was being democratized, and the weapon was the halberd, and its successor, the pike. The Battle of Morgarten also became the world's most effective and brutal advertisement. The story of how a few thousand mountain men annihilated the best army in Europe spread like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted Swiss soldiers in their army. For the next 2 centuries, the Swiss became the most sought-after and feared mercenaries in Europe. They were known for their discipline, their ferocity, and their absolute refusal to retreat. Kings and popes paid fortunes to hire them. The legacy of that reputation lives on today in the colorful uniforms of the Vatican's Swiss Guard, a direct descendant of this fierce martial tradition born in a bloody mountain pass. So, what is the ultimate lesson of the Battle of Morgarten? It's a story with timeless themes. It's about the fatal danger of arrogance, of underestimating your opponent. Duke Leopold was so blinded by his own sense of superiority that he couldn't imagine a world where peasants could outthink him. It's a story about the power of the underdog, proving that courage and ingenuity can overcome overwhelming odds. And most of all, it's a story about the intimate, brutal relationship between geography and warfare. The Swiss didn't just fight the Habsburgs, they made the mountains fight for them. They turned their greatest perceived weakness, their isolation and rugged homeland, into their most devastating weapon. They proved that in the right place, at the right time, 1,500 peasants could indeed annihilate the world's strongest army. The Battle of Morgarten is just one of countless stories where the course of history was changed by a single, shocking event. What part of this incredible ambush do you find most ingenious? Was it the use of the terrain, the psychological shock of the rock slide, or the brutal effectiveness of the halberd? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next battlefield.